Graduation was last night. It was invite only. Very elite. That was the text my son sent me at 8:12 this morning, as if he were telling me the weather had changed or the grocery store had closed early, and I read it 3 times before it settled into my bones because Daniel's graduation was circled on my wall calendar in red ink for 6 months, and I had already planned what I would wear, a soft blue blazer that still fit if I stood up straight, and I had even set aside gas money for the 92-mile drive to his campus, but apparently it happened. Without me, apparently it was, invite only, and I was not invited. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same oak table where I used to quiz him on spelling words and sign his report cards, and I looked at the sunlight falling across the floor as if it might rearrange the meaning of what he'd written, because surely a mother isn't considered optional at her own son's graduation, surely there had been some mistake. But there it was again when I opened the message, short and clean and distant. Last night, as though the past could be sealed off with 2 simple words, I typed back, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," and I meant it, because pride doesn't disappear just because you've been excluded, and then I placed my phone face down on the table and listened to the refrigerator hum in the quiet house that suddenly felt larger than its 1,200 square feet. Daniel used to say I never missed a milestone, and I didn't. Not when he won 3rd place in the 5th grade science fair, not when he crossed the stage at his high school graduation in a rented gown that hung a little too long at the sleeves, not when he moved into his freshman dorm room with 2 plastic bins and a second-hand desk lamp, and I remember standing in that narrow dorm hallway telling him I'd be right there in the front row when he earned his degree, and he smiled the way he used to, the way that made me believe promises were solid things. I got up slowly and walked to the living room where his childhood photo still sits on the mantel, Daniel at 9 years old holding a paper certificate with crooked bangs and missing teeth, and I dusted the frame even though it didn't need dusting, because my hands needed something to do. The idea of elite lingered in my mind like a scent I couldn't place, because Daniel was raised in a small town where we measured success by hard work and kindness, not by who made the guest list, and yet the word sounded polished and distant, like something borrowed from someone else's vocabulary. I opened my laptop and searched the university's website, scrolling through announcements about commencement ceremonies, reading that tickets were required but limited to immediate family, and I paused at that phrase, immediate family, and wondered at what point I stopped qualifying. My reflection in the dark screen looked older than 68, silver hair pulled back neatly, lips pressed into a line that wasn't anger exactly but something steadier, something quieter. I thought about the mornings I left before sunrise to clean office buildings so Daniel could focus on classes instead of tuition bills, about the overtime shifts that added up to thousands of hours over 4 years, about the envelope I mailed every semester with a check that always cleared on time, and none of that felt elite, it felt ordinary and necessary and done out of love. I checked my phone again even though I told myself I wouldn't, and there were no new messages, no explanation, no, "I'm sorry you couldn't make it." Just silence, and in that silence I felt the first small crack form. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture between what I believed about my place in my son's life and what this morning's text suggested, and I realized that whatever had happened last night, whatever decisions were made about who belonged and who didn't, I was going to need to understand it, because a ceremony may last 2 hours, but exclusion has a way of echoing long after the applause fades. The house felt different the rest of that morning, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the meaning of that message and were holding it quietly against me, and I moved through my kitchen the way I always did, rinsing my coffee mug, folding the dish towel neatly over the oven handle, checking the thermostat even though the temperature had not changed, because routine is sometimes the only thing that keeps a heart from drifting too far into questions it cannot answer. I told myself there must have been a reason, something logistical, something simple, perhaps tickets were limited to 2 and Daniel chose his wife. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about dates, perhaps I had misread the website, and yet the word elite kept circling back like a small stone in my shoe, not painful enough to stop me, but impossible to ignore. I opened my laptop again and searched for photos from the university's ceremony, scrolling carefully through images of rows of graduates in black gowns and caps tossed into a clear blue sky, families clustered together on the green lawn, mothers with corsages pinned to pastel dresses, fathers in pressed suits with hands resting proudly on shoulders, and I felt a tightening in my chest that I refused to call hurt because I have learned that naming pain too quickly gives it more power than it deserves. Then I saw a familiar face. Daniel standing taller than I remembered, his tassel hanging slightly to the left, and beside him was his wife, Vanessa, wearing a pale cream dress and oversized sunglasses, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she had always been the one who carried him to this moment, and around them stood her parents and her younger sister, all smiling into the camera with the kind of ease that comes from belonging without question. I looked carefully at the background, counting chairs, noticing empty rows near the back, noticing that this did not look like some exclusive gathering hidden behind velvet ropes. It looked like a standard commencement ceremony held on a public campus lawn that stretches nearly half a mile from one end to the other. I checked the time stamp on the photograph, posted the previous evening at 6:42, and the caption read, "So proud to celebrate with those who truly matter," and I read that line slowly, once, twice, 3 times, not because I did not understand the words, but because I was trying to understand where I fit within them. I closed the laptop gently, not in anger but in deliberation, and walked to the hallway closet where I had already hung my blue blazer, the one I had pressed carefully 2 nights ago, and I ran my hand over the sleeve, feeling the smooth fabric that had been waiting for a day that came and went without me. I thought about the 92-mile drive I did not make, about the gas tank I had filled in anticipation, about the small card I had written in neat cursive wishing him courage and integrity in the next chapter of his life, and I realized that what unsettled me most was not the missed ceremony itself but the quiet decision made somewhere along the way that I did not belong in the front row anymore. I returned to the kitchen and sat down again, this time with my phone in my hand, and I considered calling Daniel, not to accuse, not to demand, but to ask one simple question, yet something inside me told me to wait, to gather facts before feelings, to understand the shape of this exclusion before I allowed it to define me. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past slowly, its engine humming steadily, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm, and I felt a small shift inside my chest. A steadiness replacing the earlier shock, because if there is one thing I have learned in 68 years, it is that silence often hides more than it reveals, and I was no longer willing to sit quietly with a word like elite without finding out exactly who decided that I did not qualify. By late afternoon I had made a decision that surprised even me, because instead of calling Daniel immediately, I drove to the university campus the following day, telling myself that a 92-mile trip was not too far for clarity, and the highway stretched out in front of me in long gray lines that felt steady and predictable compared to the confusion in my mind. I parked in a visitor lot that charged $3 per hour and walked slowly across the wide lawn where commencement had taken place, the grass still marked faintly with white lines from folding chairs that had been arranged in neat rows, and I stood there imagining where Daniel might have walked, where Vanessa might have stood for photographs, where applause had risen into the warm evening air while I sat at home unaware. The campus was open, not gated, not guarded by any special list, just brick buildings and students carrying backpacks, parents snapping late photographs near the fountain, and I felt the word elite dissolve a little more with each step I entered the administration building and approached the information desk, introducing myself politely and asking about the ceremony schedule from 2 nights before, explaining that I had been out of town and was hoping to purchase a program as a keepsake, and the young woman behind the desk smiled kindly and handed me one without hesitation, telling me that the event had been open to all immediate family members with tickets distributed weeks in advance and that there had been extra seating available on the lawn for anyone who wished to attend. I thanked her and stepped aside, flipping through the glossy pages until I found Daniel's name printed clearly under the College of Business, and I traced the letters gently with my fingertip as if confirming his achievement in a language that could not be erased. There was no mention anywhere of exclusivity beyond standard ticket limits, nothing that suggested a private gathering reserved for a chosen few, and I felt a calm settle over me, not relief, but recognition, because facts have a way of removing the fog that emotions create. I walked back outside and sat on a wooden bench near the fountain where water arched quietly into the air, and I remembered the first time Daniel visited this campus at 18 years old, nervous and hopeful, promising me that he would make every sacrifice worthwhile. And I believed him because I had raised him to value loyalty and gratitude. I thought about Vanessa's caption again, about celebrating with those who truly matter, and I realized that what troubled me most was not her presence beside him, she is his wife after all, but the deliberate framing of belonging and exclusion, the subtle rewriting of history in which my years of support were reduced to background noise. I opened my phone and reviewed the original message from Daniel once more, studying the punctuation, the brevity, the absence of warmth, and I began to wonder whether those words had truly come from him or whether they had been shaped by someone else's priorities. I did not feel anger rising, I felt clarity forming, and clarity is far more powerful than anger because it does not shout, it observes. As I sat there watching a group of parents laugh while adjusting a graduate's cap for one more photograph, I understood that whatever explanation awaited me, it would not be found in assumptions, it would be found in quiet questions asked at the right time, and I stood up from the bench with the program folded neatly in my purse, knowing that the distance between a mother and her son is not measured in miles on a highway but in the choices made about who is allowed to stand in the front row. When I returned home that evening the house no longer felt wounded, it felt observant, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next, and I placed the university program carefully on the kitchen counter beside the blue blazer that had never left its hanger. Then I washed my hands slowly, deliberately, as though rinsing away assumptions I no longer needed. I did not call Daniel that night because I wanted my voice to be steady, not fragile, and steadiness takes time, so instead I sat at my desk in the small room that once held his high school trophies and opened my laptop again, this time not to search photographs but to review the past few months, scrolling through messages between Daniel and me, noting the subtle changes that I had dismissed before, the shorter replies, the rescheduled Sunday visits, the polite but distant tone that replaced his usual warmth. I found an email from 3 weeks earlier in which he had mentioned commencement tickets being distributed soon, and I remembered responding with excitement, asking how many guests he would be allowed to bring, and his reply had been vague, saying that details were still being finalized, and I had accepted that answer because trust makes you generous with ambiguity. As I sat there under the soft light of my desk lamp I began to trace a pattern that did not appear overnight but unfolded gradually. Invitations to dinner that shifted from my home to Vanessa's parents' house, holidays that were described as busy or crowded, small remarks about networking and appearances that seemed harmless at the time but now felt connected to a larger effort to curate who stood beside Daniel during important moments. I remembered a conversation last winter when Vanessa had laughed lightly about how certain events required the right look, and I had assumed she meant attire or presentation, not people. Yet now I wondered whether I had been quietly categorized as inconvenient, too modest for photographs. Meant to impress colleagues and professors, I opened social media once more and studied the graduation photographs more carefully, noticing that Daniel's arm rested confidently around Vanessa's father, noticing the angle of the shots that excluded empty seats, noticing how the captions emphasized achievement and sophistication, and I felt neither jealousy nor resentment. Only an awakening awareness that narratives can be edited just like pictures. I checked my email again and searched for the university's name, and that is when I found something I had overlooked earlier, a forwarded confirmation receipt from the alumni office thanking me for a generous donation to the commencement celebration fund, a donation I had never authorized, and I stared at the amount, $2,000, paid from an account number that matched mine, and I felt a stillness settle over me that was colder than surprise but clearer than anger. I reviewed my recent bank statements and saw the charge processed under my name 3 days before the ceremony, and I realized that someone had used my information to elevate the image of generosity without informing me, and suddenly the phrase invite-only elite shifted meaning, because perhaps the exclusivity was never about tickets at all but about shaping a story in which Daniel and Vanessa appeared self-made, polished, independent of the woman who worked overtime shifts to keep tuition paid. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap, breathing slowly, because clarity requires composure, and I understood that the real issue was not a missed ceremony but a deliberate repositioning of my place in my son's life, and as the evening light faded beyond my window I made a quiet promise to myself that the next conversation I had with Daniel would not be fueled by accusation but guided by facts, because if someone had chosen to rewrite the narrative of his success, they would soon discover that I still held the original draft. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already arranged the facts in neat rows like chairs on a lawn, and I made coffee slowly, measuring 2 careful tablespoons into the filter, listening to the steady drip as it filled the glass pot, reminding myself that calm decisions begin with quiet moments. I carried my mug to the dining table and laid out the printed bank statement beside the alumni donation receipt, smoothing the pages flat as though preparing documents for a meeting rather than a confrontation, and I studied the details once more, the date 3 days before the ceremony, the amount $2,000, the confirmation email sent to an address that Daniel and Vanessa both had access to when they helped me set up online banking last year. I did not feel outrage. I felt precision, because what unsettled me most was not the money itself but the assumption that I would not notice, that my role could be reshaped without my knowledge, that generosity could be borrowed and repackaged as part of someone else's polished narrative. I thought about the years Daniel watched me balance checkbooks at this very table, about how I taught him to reconcile numbers down to the last cent, about how I insisted that financial responsibility was a reflection of character, and I wondered when transparency became optional in his world. At 9:30 in the morning I dialed the alumni office and asked, in a steady voice, whether the donation had been processed online or by phone, and the representative explained that it had been submitted electronically with a personalized message attached thanking the university for supporting families who value excellence and distinction, and I wrote those words down carefully, excellence and distinction, recognizing the echo of language that had framed me as outside the circle. After I ended the call I sat quietly for several minutes, not reacting, just absorbing, because clarity requires space to settle. I opened my phone and drafted a message to Daniel asking if he and Vanessa could come by that evening, explaining that I had a few documents I wanted to review with him, and I kept the tone neutral, almost administrative, because I wanted him to walk through my door without defensiveness clouding his expression. He replied within 20 minutes, saying that they would stop by after work, and I noticed that he did not ask what the documents were about, which told me more than words could. I spent the afternoon moving through the house in a measured way, folding laundry, watering the small herb garden on the back patio, glancing occasionally at the framed photographs that traced the timeline of Daniel's life from kindergarten to commencement, and I realized that my power did not lie in raised voices or emotional appeals. It lay in memory and record, in the steady accumulation of truth that cannot be erased by a curated caption. By 5:45 in the evening I had arranged the papers neatly on the dining table, aligned with the wood grain, and when the doorbell rang at 6 sharp I felt no tremor in my hands, only a quiet readiness, because whatever explanation awaited me, I was prepared to listen first and speak second. And as I opened the door to see Daniel standing there in his pressed shirt beside Vanessa's carefully composed smile, I understood that sometimes the most significant graduations are not marked by caps and gowns but by the moment a mother decides she will no longer allow her story to be edited without her consent. Daniel stepped into the house first, his eyes scanning the familiar living room as though it had subtly changed since the last time he was there, and Vanessa followed a half-step behind him with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and I closed the door gently before walking toward the dining table where the documents were arranged in straight, deliberate lines. I did not offer coffee because this was not a social visit, and I did not raise my voice because calm has a way of unsettling those who expect emotion. Daniel cleared his throat and asked what I wanted to review, and I gestured for them to sit, then took my own chair at the head of the table where I used to help him with algebra homework, and for a moment I noticed how his shoulders seemed broader than they had when he left for college, yet something in his posture felt uncertain. I slid the bank statement across the table first, pointing to the $2,000 transaction dated 3 days before commencement, and then I placed the alumni office receipt beside it with the confirmation number circled neatly in blue ink, and I asked a simple question, not accusing, not dramatic, just direct. Can you explain this to me? Daniel looked down at the papers and then at Vanessa, and that brief glance told me more than any speech could, because confusion rarely seeks approval before answering. Vanessa leaned forward slightly and said that the donation had been a gesture of support for the university. That it reflected well on the family, that opportunities like commencement are enhanced by visible generosity, and she spoke with the same smooth tone I had heard in social settings, as though this were a minor oversight rather than a decision made without my consent. I listened without interrupting, allowing her words to settle in the room, and then I asked another question, equally calm. Did you ask me before using my account? There was a pause that stretched longer than comfort allows. And Daniel finally said that he assumed I would not mind, that it was for a good cause, that it was meant to help strengthen connections for future opportunities, and I noticed how easily the word assumed slipped from his mouth, as though my agreement were an automatic extension of his ambition. I folded my hands in front of me and held his gaze steadily, reminding myself that clarity does not require volume, and I said, "It is not about the money, Daniel. It is about being informed. It is about respect, Vanessa shifted in her chair and added that the ceremony had been structured carefully, that there were expectations, that certain guests were prioritized for networking, and there it was again, that quiet redefinition of belonging framed as strategy. I looked at my son and asked the question I had rehearsed silently on the drive home from campus: did you believe I did not belong there? His eyes flickered downward and then back to mine, and for a second I saw the boy who once asked me to sit in the front row at his middle school award ceremony, and he said softly that it was complicated, that he did not want unnecessary tension, that he thought it would be easier this way, and I understood then that convenience had replaced consideration. I did not argue, I did not accuse Vanessa, I did not recount every overtime shift or every tuition payment, because those facts already lived between us, and instead I leaned back slightly and said, graduation is meant to mark growth. It is meant to show who you have become. I only wanted to stand there because I helped you begin. Silence filled the room again, not hostile, not explosive, just heavy with realization, and in that quiet I felt the shift I had sensed days earlier complete itself, because this conversation was no longer about a ceremony missed, it was about the foundation of trust being quietly rearranged without my knowledge, and as Daniel sat there absorbing the weight of his choices, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by anger but by the steady boundaries I was finally prepared to set. Daniel did not argue after that, and that silence lingered in the room like something fragile placed between us, and Vanessa's carefully measured composure began to thin at the edges as she shifted in her seat and said that everything had been done with good intentions, that appearances matter in professional circles, that certain impressions can shape opportunities. And I listened to her words as one might listen to a distant radio station, aware of the sound but focused on something steadier. Inside myself, I looked at my son again and asked him, not harshly, not accusingly, when you wrote that it was invite-only and elite, were those your words? He hesitated just long enough for truth to surface, and he admitted that Vanessa had suggested how to phrase it, that she believed it would avoid unnecessary discussion, that it would make the situation seem structured rather than personal. And I nodded slowly because clarity often arrives wrapped in discomfort. I told him that structure is one thing and exclusion is another, and that words carry weight even when spoken casually. And then I explained something he had once known instinctively as a child, that respect is not measured by who stands beside you for a photograph but by who stands beside you when there are no cameras at all. Vanessa began to respond again about networking in curated environments, and I held up my hand gently, not to silence her but to pause the repetition, and I said that I understood ambition, that I had spent decades working overtime to support it, but ambition without gratitude eventually narrows into something brittle. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly as if a realization had settled on them, and he said that he did not want to hurt me, that he thought avoiding a potential disagreement between me and Vanessa would protect everyone, and I told him that protection built on concealment rarely protects anyone. It only delays consequence. I slid the university program toward him and pointed to his name printed in clean black letters, and I said, you earned this degree. I never questioned that. But I also earned the right to witness it. The room was quiet again, and I could see him absorbing the distinction between achievement and acknowledgement. I did not raise my voice, I did not recount every tuition payment or every early morning drive to his campus, because those sacrifices were never transactional, they were expressions of love, and love does not invoice, but it does remember. Finally I folded the bank statement back into a neat stack and said calmly that I would be adjusting my financial accounts moving forward, that shared access would be discontinued, that future contributions would require explicit conversation and consent, and I watched as both of them processed that shift, not dramatic, not punitive, simply defined. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to negotiate, but Daniel placed a hand lightly on the table and said he understood, and in that moment I saw something in him recalibrate. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to recognize that growth sometimes begins when comfort ends. I stood up slowly and walked them to the door, and as Daniel stepped outside he paused and said that he should have handled things differently, that he should have called me before the ceremony, and I met his eyes and said that adulthood is not proven by excluding the past but by integrating it with integrity. When the door closed behind them the house did not feel wounded anymore, it felt grounded, and I realized that the most significant change had not been his graduation but my decision to redraw the boundaries of my own narrative. Because if elite means curated and controlled, then I was content to remain something else entirely, something steady, something honest, something that does not disappear simply because it is not photographed. The house was quiet after they left, but it was not the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, it was the kind that settles like a decision already made, and I stood by the door for a moment with my hand resting lightly on the brass handle, listening to the sound of their car pulling away down the street, noticing how ordinary the evening looked, neighbors walking their dogs, a lawn sprinkler ticking methodically across a patch of green, the sky softening into a pale gold that did not concern itself with who had been invited. I returned to the dining table and gathered the documents into a single folder, not hiding them, not dramatizing them, simply organizing them the way I had organized every important paper in this house for the last 40 years, and as I placed the folder inside my desk drawer I felt something steady lock into place inside me, not bitterness, not triumph, just alignment. Over the next 2 days Daniel did not call, and I did not reach out either, not as punishment but as space, because space allows reflection to do its work without interference. On the second afternoon my phone buzzed with a message from him that was longer than usual, and I read it slowly, each sentence deliberate, explaining that he had spoken with Vanessa at length, that he realized the wording of the text had been dismissive, that he should have consulted me about the donation and the tickets, that he understood now how exclusion disguised as strategy can still wound, and I noticed that he did not defend the phrase elite this time. I did not respond immediately because growth deserves to be acknowledged carefully, not rushed, and I walked to the living room where the framed graduation announcement still rested unopened on the side table, the envelope addressed in Vanessa's precise handwriting, and I opened it finally, unfolding the heavy cardstock invitation that had once seemed like a promise, and I studied the date and time printed clearly at the top, realizing that the ceremony had never been hidden, it had simply been withheld. I placed the card beside Daniel's childhood photograph on the mantel and stood back, observing the distance between the two images, one of innocence and one of achievement, and I understood that my role had never been about occupying a seat in the front row but about building the foundation that allowed him to walk across any stage at all. That evening Daniel called, and when I answered his voice sounded less polished, less rehearsed, and he said that he had been thinking about what I said regarding integration and integrity, that he did not want his success to be curated at the expense of honesty, that he wanted to make it right, and I listened without interrupting, allowing him to find his own language. He asked if we could take new photographs together on campus the following weekend. Not for social media, not for presentation, but for us, and I felt the weight of that request, because restoration does not erase what happened, it acknowledges it. I told him I would consider it, that trust rebuilds through consistency, not gestures, and he agreed quietly. And when the call ended I did not feel victorious, I felt grounded. 2 days earlier I had been positioned outside an imagined circle labeled elite, and now I understood that circles drawn by others can always be redrawn by the clarity of one's own boundaries. I walked to the kitchen window and watched the evening settle across the neighborhood, the streetlights flickering on one by one, steady and reliable, and I realized that graduation marks the end of formal education, but character continues to be tested long after diplomas are framed, and in that steady light I felt certain that whatever photographs were taken in the future, I would no longer stand quietly in the shadows of someone else's edited story. The weekend arrived with a quiet kind of sunlight that made everything look softer than it had a few days before, and when Daniel pulled into my driveway that Saturday morning he stepped out of his car alone, without Vanessa, without careful framing, without the polished atmosphere that had surrounded the ceremony I never attended, and I noticed immediately that his shoulders were not squared for presentation but slightly relaxed, as if he had left something unnecessary behind. He walked up the path I had swept clean earlier and stood on the porch for a moment before knocking, and when I opened the door there was no rehearsed smile on his face, only a seriousness that felt earned rather than performed. We drove to the campus together in my sedan, the same car that had carried him to his freshman orientation 4 years earlier, and the 92-mile stretch of highway seemed shorter this time, perhaps because silence between us no longer carried confusion but reflection. When we arrived, the lawn was empty except for a few students lingering near the fountain, and Daniel carried his graduation cap in his hand rather than on his head, turning it thoughtfully as we walked across the grass where rows of chairs had once stood, and he stopped near the center of the lawn and said quietly that he had replayed the past week in his mind more times than he could count. He admitted that ambition had felt urgent, that Vanessa had spoken often about perception and influence, about how certain images can shape future partnerships, and he confessed that in trying to align with that vision he had allowed something fundamental to slip, something that did not belong to networking or status but to loyalty. I listened without interruption because I did not need to defend my place anymore, it had already been defined. He asked if we could take a photograph together, not to post immediately, not to craft a caption, but simply to mark the moment honestly, and I agreed, standing beside him on the grass under the open sky, and when another passerby offered to take the picture I felt no need to adjust my posture or disguise the lines on my face, because this was not about appearance, it was about acknowledgement. After the photograph was taken, Daniel looked at me and said that success means very little if the people who built its foundation are edited out of the frame, and I saw in his expression the understanding that growth is not measured by degrees alone but by the courage to correct a misstep. We walked slowly back toward the parking lot, and he spoke about plans for the future with a different tone than before, less concerned with elite circles and more focused on integrity. And I realized that the most important shift had not been public but private. On the drive home he reached over and adjusted the radio volume the way he used to as a teenager, absent-mindedly, comfortably, and that small familiarity felt more significant than any caption could ever be. When we pulled into my driveway he thanked me for confronting the issue calmly instead of retreating into silence, and I told him that boundaries are not walls, they are guideposts, and that love does not disappear when it demands respect. Later that evening he sent me the photograph we had taken, no elaborate wording attached, just the image of a mother and her son standing side by side on an open lawn, and as I placed my phone on the kitchen table I understood that graduation had indeed happened last week, but the more meaningful commencement had taken place quietly between us, not under banners or applause, but in the steady decision to choose honesty over presentation, and I felt certain that whatever paths Daniel walked next, he would carry this lesson with him, because the true mark of maturity is not belonging to an elite circle but recognizing who stood with you long before there was any circle to enter.